Thank you all so much for joining us, especially so late in the game. We appreciate there was a bit of a short notice for this workshop, but Shannon and Chantel were able to explain that there was a bit of appetite for understanding on-farm emissions and a bit of appetite for understanding carbon calculators, and that's how we put together this workshop with the AIA team today. So Sarah and Brady are joining us from AIA, and they'll give some context in actually working through the tool and how AIA is a little bit different to the other calculators. But I really wanted to start today by very, very quickly going through some of the key terms. So I have a lot of slides and a lot to cover because there's so much in the background of this space when you start looking at international drivers of emission reporting, our national policies, and some of the supply chain changes that farmers are using to get different premiums, but also can expect moving into the future. So I'm going to go through quite a few things very, very quickly, just to give you a bit of an overview of the space. So I guess if there's at any point where you have a question, please interrupt me because we really want to make sure this is a meaningful exercise for you guys and that you have a bit of context to go through the tool with Brady a little bit later. So I'm Tani. I'm the Carbon Farming Outreach Program Coordinator with Landcare Victoria. I want to start today by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands of which the work of Landcare Victoria occurs, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Today I'm in Naarm on Wurundjeri country. Um, Again, we've got a little bit of a jam-packed agenda today. I'll be going through a little bit of these topics, talking a little bit about climate change and why we're driving for net zero and reduced emissions, a little bit about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and what you can expect on your farms, and then a little bit about the Greenham's premium and some of the supply chains that we're already seeing looking for emissions data. Please interrupt at any point. I really, really welcome questions and want to make sure this is as useful for you guys as it can be. Just a little bit of a reminder of why we're doing this. The science of climate change is pretty well established now, and we're already seeing those impacts across the state of Victoria. We're seeing more sporadic rainfall, we're seeing higher temperature extremes, and every ton of greenhouse gas emitted really does put us into higher risk areas of our changing climate. For those that may want to have a little bit more of an explore about what your risk is to different climate extremes, there's the ACS Data Explorer. There's also My Climate View, which can also look at different commodities and agricultural products for your specific region. And we'll look at the impacts of the changing climate on those. So again, just to flag that there's going to be massive impacts. Producers are already seeing the impacts of drought, fire, floods, definitely on the short end of the stick in terms of extreme weather vulnerability. So just a note to say, if you're interested in learning more, you can go to those resources. The need to rapidly decarbonize and stop emitting greenhouse gases is what has led to a lot of these major policy commitments at an international level. Now, I know there's a lot of talk in the media recently about us hitting 1.5 degrees. We technically haven't hit it yet, but we are still on track for about 2.7 degrees warming. So we are at a point in time where we do really need to rapidly change our economies and change our emissions because we're moving beyond the safe levels of warming at 1.5 and 2 degrees. The largest kind of commitment that has happened internationally is a Paris Agreement that does say that we should be trying to stay below that 1.5-degree level. I also just want to flag a terminology point here. We're going to talk a little bit about net zero. That doesn't mean zero emissions, but it does mean the amount of carbon we're emitting as a planet is equal to the sequestration, and that's the drawdown of carbon from things like trees. There's also a whole range of different technologies that are available to sequester carbon. There's blue carbon that can be sequestered through seagrass, for example. I don't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but if you have any questions, please feel free to, yell out. So again, agriculture isn't the only sector that produces emissions, but I guess the key point is that all sectors are going to have to start rapidly reducing the amount we produce. The main emissions from ag are nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. So depending on your farming system, it's going to depend on your different emission profiles. Again, agriculture doesn't make up the majority of Australia's emissions. That's primarily through, energy production. But we are seeing a reduction in our emissions overall from the energy sector. So agriculture is going to become a bigger part of the puzzle as we continue moving towards 2030 and continue seeing decarbonisation in other sectors. Again, every emissions profile for every farm is different. Every farm type is going to have a different emission profile. So I think it's really important that we're actually looking at carbon calculators today because you actually do have the ability to start thinking about where your emission sources are on farm and where there could be opportunities for reduction. Not to spoil my own presentation though, overall, we find that Victorian farmers are some of the best in the world. So if you're already operating an efficient farm, learning your carbon numbers probably won't change your production very much, but it may allow you to start thinking about how your farm can be sustainable in the future. And if there is increased efficiencies you can take up, then there might be opportunities there as well. This slide is to talk a little bit about the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the fact that, again, we're already seeing farms' profitability start to reduce from the impacts of climate change now. So we're seeing government response to climate change through the Paris Accord and a whole range of different other international commitments and treaties, most often put together through the Conference of Parties with the UN. But we're also seeing a whole range of different international commitments through supply chains and multinational corporations. 100 companies are responsible for 70% of the world's emissions. So often these supply chain points can be more meaningful than government action. But we're also need to be mindful that Australians' agriculture is primarily for export, and we're seeing a majority of other countries start making these commitments, especially in the EU, where we see emissions numbers for produce being tied to import into those countries as well. So again, it's just really important we start thinking about the international context. And then there's a whole range of different Australian government policies and initiatives to keep in mind as well. Because again, our government is making commitments to reduce agricultural emissions too. Victoria's agricultural emissions have actually been reducing. At the same time, our production has been increasing. So I think that's a really important message here too. We're already seeing emission reduction through increasing efficiencies in Victorian agriculture. And I guess as well, there's a lot of messaging out there talking about agriculture being net zero. However, we're not actually expecting it to be at an international level, state level, national level. It's just about making sure that agriculture sees reduced emissions to be sure that we are staying as effective and efficient as possible. But we're always going to need food and fiber, and we're seeing a growing population that we need to support. And we just don't have the technologies currently to be able to completely reduce our agricultural emissions. So I think it's really important we address that messaging now. Again, we are starting to see we are expecting to see a reduction of emissions across all sectors, including agriculture. And how that happens is all about improving our emissions intensity, so making sure we can make more with what we've got, reducing absolute emissions, insetting or offsetting, which I'll talk about in a minute, and primarily as well looking after our existing stocks. So again, if you have healthy trees on your farm, this is going to be a carbon stock. And it's really important that as we're considering taking action to reduce emissions, we remember that carbon is just the start of considering on-farm sustainability. And again, this is the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, and you can see it considers all kinds of things like biodiversity, like water, like healthy animals, and vibrant workers. So making sure that you're not taking actions to only plant pine trees because you're only thinking about emissions, because those can sometimes limit your ability to be able to adjust to more sustainable farming operations in the future. So again, don't just consider carbon, consider a whole range of things. And there's a whole range of other initiatives internationally and nationally that are considering sustainability too. Supply chains are looking for reduced emissions reporting. They're looking for a whole range of different commitments. And we're starting to see as well the supply chains committing to different science-based targets or emission reduction targets. So if you're able to know your number, you're then able to start looking at some of these supply chains, especially as we see increased reporting responsibilities through Australian legislation imposed on those larger corporate companies. Some companies like Greenham's have already started introducing sustainability premiums, and that's basically driven by consumers. So because consumers want to see uh, leaner, healthier meats that are lower emissions, that drives the premiums that they have available for producers. Again, carbon isn't the only thing considered in these things. There's different tiers that get you different premiums based on where you're at. But this is generally found to be building on existing practices. So again, if you have really good pasture, if you have, efficient animals, you may be surprised to find it where you already are is sitting pretty good in terms of where we can expect emissions to be. Again, we're seeing increased corporate responsibility driving the need for farmers to report because we'll see um, increasing pressure, but we're also seeing financial institutions starting to reward some of this sustainable farming behavior as well. So NAB, Commonwealth, Westpac, and others have got premiums available for those that are starting to invest on farm sustainability. Not all emissions are created equal. Actually, I'll pause there. Do we have any questions about any of that? All right, I'm going to keep powering through. A reminder that we're going through quite a few different things, so let me know if there's something that you um, would like to, repeat or catch up on. Um, this is called your CO2 equivalents. So basically, the values that you have for each of these emissions can relate back to CO2. So nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas we're incredibly mindful of in our farming emissions because it's 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide. The very same with methane. Again, you're looking at greenhouse gas you're looking at carbon equivalents of about 28 to 1 carbon dioxide. So again, we've got three kinds of emissions that you want to kind of think about. You want to think about your scope one emissions, your scope two emissions, and your scope three emissions. Scope one are the emissions from your own farm. Scope two are the emissions for the things usually this is like power that you buy onto your farm. And scope three emissions are the emissions associated with the products that you bring onto your farm to support your operations. So this could be things like fertilizer, it could be things like feed, it could be things like hay in drought, just depending on your operations. There's a whole range of different things. This does mean, though, that when a company or a feed yard or whoever buys your products, you are then their scope three emissions. So this is where the reporting comes in terms of international or national companies reporting on their emissions. They want to buy products that are associated with a lower emission because it then lowers their scope three, which lowers their overall emissions, which they're reporting on. You have two choices if you're looking at your on-farm carbon. If you are looking at insetting, that means you're looking at using the carbon that you've sequestered through trees and healthy soil on your farm or healthy dams to be able to inset against your products, meaning that you basically look at your emissions, reduce that by the carbon stored to get your carbon footprint. If you're insetting, you report this on a supply chain. If you're offsetting, you can then sell this carbon sequestration, so the carbon you've stored on your property, through carbon credits. I won't talk very much about this today, but just to say that the most common method is the ACCU scheme. There's a whole range of different registered projects, and there's also a nature repair market that's now come into play. But again, please ask questions if you'd like to know more there.
Can I
The
just stop you
calculate
there? Sorry. And can you just explain what accus are for everybody here?
Thank you. Yeah, no worries at all. So ACCUs are a financial product. a bit like a stock market that's run by the Clean Energy Regulator, and you can take 1 ton of stored CO2 on your property that's been verified through a proper methodology that's been approved by the Australian government and sell that to offset someone else's emissions. So often companies like Qantas that are flying planes, they want to be able to operate carbon neutrality, or they've had a whole bunch of people click that they want to offset their flights. Um, so they will buy ACCUs to make up the difference between their emissions and carbon neutral. Does that make sense?
And ACCU stands for Australian. Do you want to just explain
Carbon
what that
credit
is?
unit,
Yes.
yeah,
Thank you.
scheme. Sorry. Thank you.
No,
That's
you're
such a
right.
good reminder, Chantel. Thanks. So yeah, Australian carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent if you're reducing some of those other gases as well. So our carbon calculators are really important in allowing us to actually understand our emissions intensity um, for our farms and how effective we're being at producing food and fiber. Again, these have come down from a international level to a national level to a farmer level. So there are things that the calculators don't consider that are still coming through and being reviewed by research, right? So we'll see the generalizations for the amount of carbon that's being sequestered based on different tools that are available, like the LOC tool that's been produced by CSIRO. And you'll see a whole range of different calculator options available. So they're roughly right, and they're the best we have available. Um, when you're calculating your emissions with Brady in a minute, you'll be looking at your inputs, then your livestock numbers, then your fertilizer numbers, energy and fuel use. You'll add all of that together and then subtract your carbon sequestration that you could expect from the trees and soil you have on your farm. The carbon sequestration from these things is also going to be pretty related to your rainfall as well. So that will give you an idea of your emissions intensity, which will basically allow you to understand where you sit. There's a whole range of different benchmarks. And again, the expected carbon will relate to your rainfall region and the size of your operations as well. And when we talk about emissions intensity, it's to say that, that's because if you've got a larger farm, you're going to have a larger carbon footprint probably. If you have a smaller farm, you have a smaller carbon footprint. So we want to take those overall emissions and look at the amount of product you're producing with them, and that's why we talk about emissions intensity. This is a very quick slide to say there's a whole range of tools. If you're looking at tools, you want to be looking at those that are based around the GAF tools that were originally developed by Richard Eckard and the team at University of Melbourne. As of yesterday, I heard Sarah and Brady, please correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I'm pretty sure that these tools have been sitting as Excel spreadsheets and they're not necessarily the most user friendly. And that's where tools like the AIA have come in, is to actually help farmers understand, where their reporting is at and have a little bit of an easier user interface rather than just having a spreadsheet full of data.
Yeah, correct, Tony. We worked very closely with Richard Eckard, the creator of the GAF tools. He sits as the chair of our technical advisory panel. We worked very closely with him to make those tools a bit more user-friendly.
Lovely. And I guess this is a little bit of bad news if you have used any of these tools previously, is because we see those ratings for different emissions change based on the best available science. There's actually a whole range of different GAF tool versions. So if you've done it 6 months ago, a year ago, those tools may not have updated, or they may have updated on the back end of a spreadsheet. And it can be a bit of an arduous process to be able to then copy all that data over to have like for like in your emissions reporting. So that's where accessible platforms like AIA are really important, because they actually do those adjustments in the back end for you. And you get to focus on what I think is a much easier process calculating your emissions. Just a note to say that, yeah, emissions intensity, you're looking at the amount of emissions you produce per ton of product. Just again, the 1 ton of CO2 could be a flight Paris to New York. Much better emissions intensity if you're comparing vegetarian food and horticulture to, say, cattle. Cattle's quite emission intensive. But again, just to say that, we don't have to be net zero. We're just having to look at our emissions and understand where we're at now. There's a whole range of different tools that are available for data collection. Brady will talk you through a few of them now. And I guess the advice I would say is just to start from today. Don't focus on going back too much, but if you're able to use your BAS statements and, the time you have in the office to input the data into these tools, it can make it a much better experience. There's no immediate need from supply chains in most cases to be reporting this, but we have until around 2030, experts say, is when you want to start thinking about having a number associated with your products. So if you are working on it now, you have a few years to kind of get used to some of these systems, wrap your head around it, seek further knowledge, and start thinking about where you may want to pull on these levers to reduce your on-farm emissions. Just to say as well, though, that this isn't the be all and end all of reducing emissions on farm. There's some really exciting new technologies emerging. 3-NOP, for example, if you have a system where you're able to feed twice a day, can be a really great way to be able to reduce on farm emissions. Genetics is also becoming increasingly more important. And if you're able to, buy cattle and livestock with a lower emissions profile, because that's something that's, related to their burping and their ruminary system. So you are able to like slightly reduce your emissions through all these things. You can reduce your emissions through increasing, your on-farm trees, and that's available now. But just to say that there's a whole range of existing technologies that are coming more affordable, and there's new technologies that are coming online every day. So as you consider your on-farm emissions, please don't feel like this is the be all and end all of where this space is going. There's going to be increasing opportunities to continue increasing your on-farm productivity while reducing your emissions. And there's going to be increasing support in the space, I think, as well. Does anyone have any questions? I'm so sorry. I know I went a little bit over and covered so much through that talk. I'm happy to provide slides too, Shannon and Chantel, just in case anyone wants to have a read over that later. And if any questions pop up for you, please feel free to email me. We also have a whole range of webinars and support materials available on the Landcare Victoria website. We have a whole 90-minute webinar explaining some of the theory behind the carbon calculators that I didn't have time to go into now. So I'd really encourage you to have a look there if there is anything you want to learn more of. But if everyone is feeling
I have a
confident,
question. I have a question.
yep.
So we're going to end up with a number. Is that number through the year something that we have to calculate all the time? Like, is it a live number, or is it like your tax where you just do it once a year and that's the number for the year?
Depends on your appetite, I guess, Robin. You can 100% do it every single month, and I would encourage you, if you have the data of your weights and your fuels, to be able to keep up with those receipts. But that will then give you an annual number for the year. And that's what you'll use with your supply chain. At the moment, though, the annual year, you're going to see a lot of variability based on your, stocking rates, destocking. We've been in drought, so you might have increased your, buying in for fuel and food and everything else. So I guess as well, it's also about making sure that you understand where that number reflects your farming system. And again, as we start seeing the market mature, it may become an average over a number of years as well to start, taking account for that climate variability there too. So, Richard Eckard's spoken on this a few times where he thinks they'll start moving towards an industry average. So you'll take your average over 3 to 5 years, but I guess we're not at a point of maturity in the market where people are able to do that yet, because there's very few farmers that have that level of data, and it's not necessarily easy for farmers to be able to go back and back calculate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Cool, no worries. Please yell out if you have any more questions. And again, I'm always available if there's more information you'd like. But I think at the moment I might pass over to Sarah and Brady with AIA, and they'll be able to talk a little bit more about the calculator we'll be using today.
Thanks, Tani. Hi everyone. My name's Sarah. I'm from Agricultural Innovation Australia, and my colleague Brady is also on the call, who'll be taking you through the calculator very shortly. Probably just to back up Tani there, from a GAF perspective, carbon accounting is a 12-month period, just like a normal accounting period. But you can choose if you want to align that seasonally with your activities on farm, you can do that too, but it's typically a 12-month period. So thanks, Tony. Brady, are you able to share the slides?
Yep.
Fantastic. Excellent. So thanks everyone for your time. I know you're all very busy people. So thanks. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn about carbon accounting today with us. Brady, do you want to flick to the next slide? I'm just going to do a short intro on AIA just to give you some context around who we are and why we have actually done some work in this space. So AIA was established by all 15 of the Rural Research and Development Corporations in very late 2020. You're probably familiar with the RDCs, the likes of Grains Research and Development Corporation or Meat and Livestock Australia. So there's 15 of those. And they set us up with a mandate to really support all of agriculture, fisheries and forestry and to work on some of those complex challenges that really no sector should tackle alone. So things like climate and carbon fit very neatly into that space. And what we do is we kind of facilitate collective investment into those solutions, and we really look at whole of agriculture solutions. So how do we create a foundation that supports everybody and lifts the sector as a whole? Really importantly, we were set up as an independent and not-for-profit company. So it's really important to our work in this carbon space in particular, because you can be really comfortable that we are not a commercial entity. We're not trying to access your data or on-sell your data. Brady will talk a little bit about how we are NFF data code certified. So we're really about supporting producers across Australia, as opposed to trying to access data or share your data with anyone. Just on the right hand side there, as I said, our mandate is whole of ag. We look at the long-term interests of industry, not sort of the short-term needs. So we've been working in this space for about 3.5 years, and we're really trying to help the sector avoid duplication, hence that collective investment approach. And how do we look at developing self-sustainable business models around some of this work? Brady might touch on it too, but we were recently awarded a federal government grant last year, who have come in and stepped behind our platform as the deliverer of standards to industry. And Brady will explain a little bit about how that works with how other calculators and tools across industry can actually connect into our engine and use it. So we've got that really consistent, standardized approach for producers out there. So everyone's using the same methodology and approach. And I'll just hand over to Brady. Off you go.
Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much, Tani, for your introduction as well. Even I learned a couple new things. So yeah, I'll just maybe rehash a couple things from Tani's presentations just to, drum it in and, get us all motivated for the session ahead and talk about the why for emissions accounting. So I'll start with something positive, and that's maintaining and gaining market access. That, with emissions accounting, there's the opportunity for preferential product treatment and price premiums. There's not too many price premiums in the market as we speak, but hey, it's probably growing as we go forward. More corporates start to think about their supply chain emissions. If there's any grain growers in the room, a lot of grain growers already participate in sustainability schemes through Sustainable Grain Australia and ISCC certification. And some of the big meat processors such as Greenhams and JBS are already having their own carbon supply chain programs where, there are small price premiums available as well. In terms of markets as well, we are working towards a carbon neutral world by 2050, which does involve carbon borders. An example I'll talk about that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, where the EU, who are pretty full on with their emissions, have said that that products from 5 key sectors, which is like cement, steel, I can't remember the other two, and fertilizer, when they come into the EU, they need to have an associated emissions number. And if it's higher than EU benchmarks, they need to pay a carbon tax on that. And the idea with that is that if lower, if emissions are coming from elsewhere that are higher emissions are coming into the EU on cheaper and undercutting EU products, because EU products have higher emission standards, that there needs an equalization tax there. So I'll really touch on that fertilizer bit because it goes to show that, yeah, if the EU goes ultra low emissions whilst Australia stays, as is, which as is at the moment is pretty good comparatively, which I'll show later on, that there's the opportunity that this carbon border adjustment mechanism might be pushed onto agriculture if we're using all the high emissions fertilizers that can't get into the EU in our crops and our livestock. So yeah, certainly thinking about this emissions thing is a great way to keep access to markets such as the EU. On the right-hand side, I would show an article from Asahi from the ABC, which Asahi have said for their malt barley that they will only buy from buyers in Australia who measure their emissions going forward. So that's an example of farmers who grow that barley getting a sticky customer and a long-term relationship from filling in his spreadsheets. A little bit of the bad, talking about supply chain emissions reporting, that there's both a carrot and a stick that a lot of Australian corporates are participating in at the moment, which is, as things stand, the Australian government has introduced mandatory climate reporting for pretty much all large companies and all companies that buy farm produce, such as grain and livestock. So this is like the Coles and the Woolies of the world, where by law they need to start reporting on the emissions from their supply chain. Now, they can take some samples and model, do regional averages, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, obviously we don't know where that might go, but it's something to be aware of. On the other side, in terms of voluntary commitments from companies, there is the Science-Based Target Initiatives, which is this international scheme that a lot of large corporates, including Coles, Woolies, GrainCorp, have signed up to, which says that they need to measure their supply chain emissions and start to reduce them in the future. And that's pretty highly auditable. So yeah, as you can see, the supply chain, the top end of town are starting to think about emissions, and that will probably flow through to the farm gate. So a quick note again on scope emissions. I know I'm repeating tiny here, but yeah, it's one of these things which can be repeated a few times to make sure it sticks. And then, if carbon and emissions comes up in conversation at the pub, you can be well versed to give a categorical definition of it. So we think about our scope 1, 2, and 3. So for a farmer, scope 1 is stuff that happens inside your farm gate, inside the boundaries of your property, right? So it is diesel burn in your tractor, it is methane coming out of your cattle, it is crop residues, it is leaching and runoff from fertilizer. Scope 2 is exclusively electricity. And then scope 3 is emissions from the inputs you've bought. So for example, your scope 3 for your fertilizer is the electricity that went into the manufacturing of it and the transportation to your farm gate. From a meat processor's perspective, right, they obviously have the energy that happens, the emissions that happens inside their plant, their scope 1s, the emissions that happens from their electricity use, their scope 2, and they also have the emissions from their supply chain, which is the produce from your farm, right? And as I was saying just then, a lot of these corporates now have mandatory and voluntary emission reporting requirements and might start to ask the question a bit more. Likewise for you as well. If you want to know your scope 3 is a bit more accurate and do these calculators a bit more accurate, nothing stops you from going to your local elders on Nutrient and asking what are the emissions in this fertilizer. But just a final note on why it matters and might be important is best practice management. That pretty much all industries are gearing up to getting ready to live in a net zero world. And with that requires carbon accounting, because you cannot manage what you do not measure, right? So, going forward, your local crash repair shop, if they want to get a loan from the bank to expand, they might need to know their emissions, because otherwise, the bank won't give them a loan, because, the bank needs to know that emissions number for their reporting requirements and also for insurance reasons, et cetera, et cetera. Inside of emissions accounting as well, there's the opportunity to benchmark, identify inefficiencies, and enable data-informed decision-making. So if you get a number and you think, oh, it's a little high, it's a little low, you can see where you're doing well, see where you might be doing a bit better against peers, similar to financial benchmarking. And also just knowing these numbers, it's a great way to engage your supply chain with transparency and openness. So yeah, if you sell your farm produce to a customer you really like, it's a great way to engage with them and become their favorite customer. So how do you measure emissions? So in Australia, the GAF tool is currently the industry standard. It's developed by the University of Melbourne and soon will be in the hands of the Zero Net Emissions CRC. There's also VERG coming up as well, which has been released in draft form, which is some new, emissions requirements that we're working hard on at the moment in the back end of the calculator. And yeah, pretty much how these calculators work is it takes your production numbers from your farm and then multiplies it by emissions factors from academic sources or from other reporting requirements. So for example, you have a cow, an academic source says it belches out this amount of methane per a kilogram per day, and these tools will just calculate it for it. All you need to do is put in the numbers from that cow. And similar as well, when we talk about methane, in terms of getting a result out of these calculators, you always report your results in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent or tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's just a way with, DSEs, for example, and stocking rates. It's just a way to benchmark everything back to one. So you're comparing apples to apples when it comes time to comparing the results. And in terms of getting the data as well, when you open some of these calculators, it might be a bit daunting. But if you just go through it line by line, there's the opportunity to go like, for example, my grain yields, I know that from the top of my head. Or in terms of my fertilizer regime, I might know this, or if not, I can give a call to my local agronomist just to double check what he might have in his little notebook. And then, for example, if your electricity and fuel use, if it's not right there in your BAS, there might be an opportunity to have a chat with your accountant and be like, hey, I'm doing this emissions calculation. Can you help me find this number in the book somewhere? So with the environmental accounting platform, as we were saying before, it is based currently on GAF and soon to be based on the new emissions reporting standard. And with the idea of the environmental accounting platform is that we are funded by the federal government to be a free and standardized tool to standardize emissions accounting in Australia. We are backed by the RDCs and have great relationships with MLA GRDC to help promote the uptake of the calculator. In our tool as well, there's the opportunity to invite other people to view your account. So for example, you might be able to invite your agronomist or your accountant or employees to go through as well, and you can just let them look or you can let them edit various levels of control. But in terms of who else can see your account and your numbers, we cannot see them. We are NFF data code certified. The engine works in a way, similar to WhatsApp, that we actually can't look into how calculations are done themselves. And you can be rest assured that we've been audited on this by the NFF to say that, when we say we can't see your data, we can't see your data. So with the environmental accounting platform, we have our free online front end, which I'll show you in a second. But we also have a back-end engine based on exactly the same calculations. And with this back-end engine, we are funded by the federal government to offer it as an API and source code that anyone else can build their own app or build their own website based on our engine, which means that if you look at these companies here on this list, some of these companies are using it for their own emissions reporting purposes. Others, such as Nutrien, they sell an emissions reporting service. If you see any of these companies here and you do an emissions assessment with them, you can be rest assured that it's based on our engine, which means it's standardized to the approach that DAF wants. And yeah, you'll be able to compare apples to apples. All right. So with that, we might jump into the environment. environmental accounting platform. Yep. So with the environmental accounting platform, you just go to aiaep.com or chuck into Google AI environmental accounting platform. And here you'll see our website where you can read through for some help guides, read a bit more about us and some other useful information here or there. But to log in, you just click this button here, log in. The only thing you will ever need to log in is just your email address. There is no password. It is always a passcode sent to your email address that you log in with every single time. So I'm just going to set up a new account here from scratch to show you the setup process. Sorry, just one moment. Sometimes the email to example at Ag Innovation Australia can take a while. For my Brady Miell at Ag Innovation Australia account, it comes through quickly, but this one, it can take a moment.
Does anyone have any questions while we wait for that code to come through for Brady?
I've just got a question, Brady.
Yep.
With the companies, how you're saying some of them are using science-based targets to measure their emissions, will this
Yep.
become legislative that all of these big corporates will actually have to do that rather than using averages?
Brady, do you want me to jump in there?
Happy to, sure.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Look, we can't really sort of comment on direction that the government's going, but with any of the corporate reporting requirements they've got at the moment, and if there's some advice on the Department of Agriculture website for producers, which I'll go and find and pop in the link for you in a minute, which talks about what you can be asked for as a producer. So at the moment, there is no requirement for you to provide actuals data. So there's no one can demand this data from you and say you must provide it. They can request it. But at the moment, the government considers that sort of regional averages we were talking about before are sufficient. Where that goes in the future, though, we don't know.
Yeah. And I'd say we're doing these calculations as well. Remember that these calculations have value, not only to you, but to the supply chain you're in as well. So even if you were to do one of these calculations, like, hey, if you're best friends with the people at whoever you sell your produce to, like, sure, you can say, hey, I've done these calculations. I'm happy to provide the number. But also keep in mind that these numbers have value to them as well. So, you can have a conversation about what's in it for me, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, in terms of commenting on future policy, yeah, we can give some conjectures as Sarah just gave. But yeah, for the most part, that is between you and your relationship with your supply chain. But as things stand, it is not mandated to provide this number. All right, I've got the code.
Do you mind if I very quickly jump on that one as well, Brady? Just because the science behind a lot of these targets is still pretty new and emerging, and the on-farm data, like from actual Victorian farms actually producing, is pretty few and far between. So there can actually be a lot of value in knowing your number. I know last year there was massive canola trials that were happening across the state that were paying a premium of, I think, about $1,000 per hectare, for those that actually knew their emissions data for that, for a canola farm, because the industry groups just didn't have baselines for how much emissions are produced per ton of grain. And that's covered across a whole range of different industries, is they're still looking for data. So even if you're able to know your number, it may not necessarily meet a science-based target, but we may also not have the data available to feed that science-based target for your region in Victoria. So you can be ahead of the curve on that one as well and access the premiums that not everyone is being able to get right now because it's rare to even know your number.
Yeah, good point, Tani. And obviously, it's very important for you to know your number, not just from a reporting perspective, but also from an efficiency on farm perspective is what we like to talk about. I've just popped a link in the chat, which is the Department of Agriculture advice around for producers around any climate related financial disclosures.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, in the meantime, the code has come through and I've done the first steps of setting up the account where, yes, to start off with, it's just a case of putting in details. This we can see, we'll be honest about that. Put in what commodities you produce. Keep in mind, you can also change this later on. So today, for my parents' little property in South Australia, we're going to be doing sheep, grains. We're also going to go down to, now we do that bit in the next one. And then next we have the T's and C's, which, yes, please read through if you have the time. We would really like to make sure that we're not, pulling the wool over your eyes with when we say we don't have access to your data. You can read that there in the T's and C's, and you agree to them. And this bottom one down here, if you would like, there is the opportunity for us to see aggregated and anonymized data, which lets us know how people use the platform and informs us like, hey, how can we improve the user experience, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're feeling generous and wants to help us make the platform better, you're more than welcome to click yes here as well. All right. So here we've just gotten into the platform. Before we create a property, I'm just going to show you the advisor feature. So with the advisor feature, you click up here on account, you go to my teams, and you can invite someone to join your team and view the properties you have here. And when you invite someone to join, you have the opportunity just to make them as view only, a contributor, or actually give them control of your account as well. So for example, with your supply chain, you might say, hey, here's an opportunity to view the account. With your agronomist, you might say like, hey, punch in some numbers, help me out. Yep. So to create the new property, it's just a case of going new property. And here we see we have the entire map of Australia, and we're creating a new property. There's two ways you can do it, right? The first way is you can make a property in the ether, which is just a case of choosing the region down here along with what else you have to fill in. But if you zoom in on where your property is, which apologies, this is wrong side of the border. It's just a case of clicking the parcel. And then, if you own more than one parcel of land, you just click that on as well. But no, we haven't bought the neighbors just yet. So here, it's just the name of the property, what enterprises run here, which this determines what calculators are used. So for example, all of these ones are the individual GAF spreadsheets. So yes, we've got the usual beef, sheep, grains, but we also got some pretty niche ones in there like buffalo, goats as well. Pretty much everything here. So today we're going to be doing sheep, grains, also pasture as well, because we have some improved pastures, which we've been spreading some urea on. And also, if you want to claim sequestration from your trees as well, you can put in plantings, and that will give you a little minus number from sequestration as well. All right, so continuing down, as you can see here, it's automatically selected SA because of the parcel of land I've selected. This one here, does this property get more or less than 600 mil of rainfall? This informs how much emissions are calculated from leaching and runoff from nitrogen use. In this case, in Tinsanara, no, we've never got more than 600 mil. Come on, look at the dirt. And then confirm to create the property. Now, I've already created a property, so I'm just going to switch over to that quickly. One second. Yep, so here's the one I prepared earlier, which we're still in my farm in Tinsanara in South Australia. In terms of inputting data, on the left-hand side, you'll see, these are the tabs. Map shapes, if you're really keen, you can draw some paddocks, but it's pretty advanced. I wouldn't recommend that in your first crack. Products and commodities is to do, if you have finished commodities going out your farm gate, such as loaves of bread, you can put in some information about packaging and processing in there. But, if you're just having live animals and, trucks of grain going out your property, you don't need to worry about that. The most part happens here in business activities. And yeah, down here is your results. So in business activities, you can see that all of the commodities we selected for in setting up are here under individual tabs: livestock, cropping and pastures, trees. One thing to note on this front page as well, similar when we were talking about if you do this yearly, monthly, whatever, you can see that all these commodities are running to 1 year, which is 1st of Jan to 31st of December. So when you do emissions accounting, you need to choose what emissions you run off, right? It's not like, with your taxes where the ATO tells you what you're doing. Nope, here you get to choose. In terms of what year you choose, you can do calendar year, financial year, a year you're choosing. The only thing I would recommend is try and line it up to your emissions year, your production cycle the best you can. So for example, with my cropping, because it's winter cropping, it makes sense to have it go from January to December. But for example, with my sheep, where the breeding cycle, kicks off in winter, where the lambs hit the floor and they age up, between June and July, it would probably make more sense to run it to a financial year rather than a calendar year. But the reason why I picked a consistent emissions year here is because, I just want emissions for that 1 year. And with the calculator, in terms of getting a result at the end, you will see a result here because it's automatically chosen 1st of Jan to 31st of December. But if I change it to a financial year, I don't get a result because the calculator only has data for half the year and can't complete a calculation. So one thing I'd recommend is, set up a consistent emissions accounting year when creating your property. And there might just have to be some tweaks here or there, such as, having my sheep production system be cut off half year, just to make sure I can do the calc. All right. So I might start off with livestock in terms of setting up a mob. So to set up a mob, you go create. You just give a name of the mob, which once again, you could do all your sheep in one tab, or you can do it mob by mob, your choice. The start date for this sheep herd, which this is to do with your emissions year. So for example, to keep it consistent with the rest of our property, we're going to be doing January to December. Yep, and in here we have our data input tabs, which I'll just go into the one I made earlier to show that. So here we can see up the top we have breeding livestock, trading livestock, wool, and feed. So you treat your breeding livestock and trading livestock separately. It's just calculated slightly different in the back end. So with our breeding livestock, which is the only one we'll do today, you can see you just turn on what class of animal is present at that time. So breeding ewes, rams, wethers, etc., etc. You just turn on what you have present in your property. You'll notice as well, it's not asking if it's a merino, doonie, or anything. A sheep's a sheep according to the calculator. That's the current way things are calculated in Australia. All right, so we go into our sheep. We can see our tabs down here that we have the number of animals at the start, and you can see that flows through. In terms of changing that number, you can do additions and minuses from changing births, deaths, and aging. So in this case here, maiden breeding ewes got aged up to breeding ewes in May, so I've just done plus 40, and then that automatically calculates it in here. And then in November, we've sold the least productive and oldest of our breeding ewes, the ones that had the wrong colored tags. And here we have our sales and purchases. So you just click here, decide whether to sell or purchase, say the amount sold, and then say the weight. And when you say the weight as well, there's a little trick here which sometimes gets me, even that is the opportunity to do the total directly or do the total per head. I would almost always recommend doing total per head. So for example, with the one I did before, I've just said there were 63 kilograms per head each, times 40, and then it works out the total amount of kilograms that were sold at this time. In here as well, there's the opportunity to do lambing rates as well, but it doesn't really change your calculator at the end. So it's just up to you whether you want to put that in. Yep. With wool, you just need to do individual shearing events for each class of animal. So for example, if we go here with our rams, it will tell you how many amount of rams are present in your property at that time, the amount of those you've shorn, ideally all of them, shorn wool per animal in kilograms, and then total clean wool yield in kilograms. In terms of clean wool yield in kilograms, you might just have to do, times this number here by the amount of animals, and then multiply by the clean wool percentage. So, for example, in this situation, I times it by, 65, 70% or something, which gave me my clean wool number. I would always recommend when doing these calculations to have a pen and paper with you to the side, just in case you might need to do a back of the envelope calculation just to get from A to B. So here you can see there's all the individual shearing events where we had our rams before. Here we had our breeding ewes, our maiden breeding ewes. Yeah, and then our lambs done a bit later in the year. But yeah, all individual shearing events we have to do. And then the final tab is feed, which here it's just an opportunity to add in mineral blocks, weaner blocks, and dry seasoning mix. Pasture and cropping, if you hadn't selected pastures and cropping before, you can turn it off here, turn it on here, and then that will give you an individual tab to calculate right at the start of business activities. And then down the bottom as well, you also have the opportunity to put in feed breakdown. So for example, if some of you did a lifetime year program, you might do this, but the calculator will do default values for you on your behalf if you don't know things such as, crude protein, dry matter digestibility, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I might just show cattle quickly as well, which involves me just taking a step back. Because with cattle, it's mostly the same with sheep, with a few minor tweaks. Yep, so I've just gone back and set up my cattle quickly. So with cattle, once again, set up the consistent emissions here. So with cattle, when we get into the individual animals, you will see that similar, you're just doing the amount of head. You do changes from birth, deaths, and aging, and changes from sales and purchases. You put in the average live weight at the start, but instead of doing it month by month, as we were doing in the sheep calculator, which by the way, doing it month by month, hey, you don't need to weigh them every month, just give an approximate, they lose a couple kilograms in summer, put on a couple kilograms in spring, et cetera, et cetera. But with cattle, you put in average daily live weight gain, and then here it flows through for you. So for example, we've done 0.6. If you know what it weighs at the end of the month, or once it gets by the end of the month, you can also just work this number back and forward as well. Yeah, so that's the only difference with cattle as compared to sheep, is that you just calculate the live weight gain. Instead of doing a whole number at the end of the month, you put a average daily live weight gain. All right, I might move on to crops quickly. So we'll go create a new crop from scratch because cropping is a bit quicker in this tool as opposed to livestock. Livestock, because you're having to do monthly weights, et cetera, it can take some time to go through. And because you're having to do stock changes as well, it can take a moment. But yep, here we'll go in and make a new crop quickly. So here we're going to do a barley crop. In terms of setting up the crop, you can do area planted in hectares. So you can just put in the number here, or if you have drawn paddock maps, as I have, you can just go select a paddock really quickly. Yep, and that will calculate the amount of hectares from the map. You say what crop type it is. Enter the yield. Once again, you can do the total yield or you can do it per hectare rate. Yeah, and then it calculates your total yield for you. And then you just say whether it is irrigated or whether it's burned. So if you put in irrigation, that increases your emissions from leaching and runoff. If you burn the residue, that obviously gives you some emissions from the CO2 coming from that burning as well. Next tab is soil improvement, which is liming. Inside liming, you give the name of the application if you want, month if you want, doesn't change the calculator if you don't do it. Lime type, dolomite or limestone, and then the amount applied per hectare in tons. Now, being that we're on the limestone coast region in South Australia, we don't need liming. So we'll move on to fertilizer. So with fertilizer, it's just a case of choosing what fertilizer. And then here we'll break it down into elements and then doing the application rate per hectare in kilograms. Now, in terms of calculating the emissions at the end, it actually calculates, in terms of scope 1 emissions that happens on farm from your fertilizer, it actually calculates it per element and then calculates scope 3 by fertilizer type. So for those who might have used the GAF tool, you'll notice that the grains GAF tool, it asks you to put in elements and not the whole fertilizer type, with the exception of urea. Whether here it automatically breaks down your fertilizers to the elemental level to give a more scope 3 production, scope 3 number, and to help you by doing the elemental breakdown on your behalf. All right, so I'll put in some urea quickly. I'm just going to put in a couple more to make it a realistic crop. So, yeah, maybe some potash. And some, we'll put in some DAP. Yep. Yeah, and as you can see here, we've put in our fertilizers like that, just pretty much knowing the type of fertilizer and the application rate. Chemicals, it works on the same principle for the most part. So here we can see there's 2 ways to calculate it, which is single product, recommended, and recommended for a reason, and then total active ingredient. So with single product, it's just a case of choosing the chemical type. So herbicide, pesticide, fungicide. And then listed chemical products are down here. So for example, if we do some good old glypho, and then just do the application rate per hectare in kilograms, and then it will calculate your active ingredient for you, which are emissions calculations, except for the scope 3 from the supply chain, comes from the amount of active ingredients applied, not necessarily this chemical's that, this chemical's this, etc., etc. So for example, here glypho is easy because it's on the list, and if it's not on the list, you need to calculate the total active ingredient yourself. So here, chemical type, it's either generic other or glypho, paraquat, or diquat. These just have a slightly different emissions factor, and that's why they're separated out. But glypho, paraquat, and diquat are all in here. So please work out if it's one of those. So if it's something else, like in this case, prosulfocarb, we need to calculate the active ingredient ourselves. Oops, wrong tab. Prosulfocarb. Yep. So for example, prosulfocarb, it is 80% active ingredient. So if we, apply it at a rate of, 3 liters per hectare, we just need to go, 3 liters times 80% equals 2.4, and then times it by the amount of hectares. So it's 240 kilograms. And you'll notice there that I had to type back quickly. And that's because even though it's kilograms, it's asking for you in tons. So I've written in 0.24. Please don't write in 240 because you would have massive emissions from your chemical use. That's a little something to watch out for as well. Yep. Pasture works pretty much the same as cropping, that it's just a case of putting in your fertilizer and chemical use. And that's just a way to make sure that, if you got some improved pasture such as clover and you're spreading urea on it, those emissions are accounted for. All right. So here we're done with the enterprise and land management tab, which is your actual farming. Next, we're going to move on to energy and commodity consumption, which is electricity, fuel, and any commodities you might have brought in, such as hay or grain. So I'll just show electricity quickly. That electricity is just a case of doing a name and the dates if you so wish, saying the source of electricity about whether it's from the state grid or whether it's renewable, with renewable obviously being zero emissions, and then saying the amount. Just a heads up that with broadacre systems in cropping and livestock, electricity shouldn't affect your emissions profile very much. It's less than 1%. But obviously, if you have the accurate number, that's great. Put it in. But if not, there's certainly more areas to focus your time on. With fuel use as well, there's two ways you can do it, which is you can do it as a whole, such as what I've done with electricity, or because I have a cropping enterprise, you can do it at the paddock level. So, for example, with these numbers here, you could chuck them all together and then allocate it to the individual crops by percentage on this other page. So here we'll see with my electricity, because I did it as a whole, I just had to allocate it to other enterprises by percentage here, with that percentage in all reasonableness being a guess. But because I wanted an accurate number for my fuel, I did it at the paddock level. And with my fuel number, I could get the fuel number from my BAS, but I've actually used benchmarking, which is diesel use per inactivity per hectare and how many times I did it to give me a number at the end. So, for example, if you want to get a number from benchmarking rather than having to estimate off your total off your BAS, for example, you can just chuck into Google, fuel benchmarking your region, and normally an academic paper comes up. So here, similar to electricity, it's just a case of giving you a name, a date range if you so wish, saying the source, whether it's diesel, petrol, or LPG, and then the amount used in litres. With commodity purchases in, it's a similar principle where it's name, date range, and then the source about whether it's hay, grain, or cottonseed, the amount, and then it will allocate some scope 3 emissions from your supply chain to your farm from that calculation. All right. So as things stand, all the emissions from here are allocated to our whole farm, but they're not allocated to any individual emissions intensity. So, for example, with our crops, they have their emissions from their fertilizer and chemical use, but it doesn't have the emissions from our fuel until we go to the next tab and allocate it to the enterprise. So, as I was showing before with electricity about splitting it up between my sheep and my grains, etc., etc. Because I did my fuel individually, I can say 100% of the fuel from my canola go towards my canola crop. Yep. Similar with trees, as just a quick note as well, that if you have grains and you're using it internally, you can also allocate your grains to your sheep enterprise as well. So, for example, from my grains, if I'm keeping 20% of it of my wheat for feed or something, I can allocate it to my sheep in here. And that makes sure that those emissions from your grains that are staying on farm being ate by your sheep are allocated to your sheep to give a fair allocation. So with allocating all the bad stuff, such as extra electricity use, extra fuel use to our crops and our sheep, we can also allocate some good stuff as well, which is our trees. So with our trees down here, there's the opportunity to allocate it to your individual enterprises. So for example, with my grains, I've just done, with my trees, I've just chucked it 100% on barley because, I already get an ISCC premium for canola and I can't sell wheat to Asahi. So I'm chucking it on my barley. And just quickly before we get into the results, I'll just go through tree use quickly. So with trees, it's just a case of going in there, choosing the start date as well. You'll notice it doesn't run to a year like the other ones. It just starts. But I would, have it start up with the start of the year and try to line it up that way. But anyway, when you go in there, just a case of saying what region it's from. Keep in mind, it probably doesn't have your exact region. So for example, here in Tintinara, it's the upper southeast actually, which is between the southeast, the actual southeast and the Murray. But I've just, chosen the southeast because it's just that little bit closer. And also I get double the amount of emission sequestration from my trees from being in the southeast. Choosing the soil types, the species of trees, and the average age of trees as well. Also a case of putting the amount of hectares of trees as well, which you can have a guess. But if you were going to map one thing, I would recommend mapping your trees because when you claim, carbon sequestration, you might get some questions from, the likes of Greenhams, et cetera, about, hey, where'd you get this number from? All right, the bit we've all been waiting for, which is the results. So with our results tab, it's just down here in greenhouse gases, which before we do that, I'm just going to delete the hypothetical ones I made. So trading mob, go on here to delete, just a little cog in the right-hand corner. With the cog, you can also change the date and the name. Yep. So with our results, remember that it's got to line up to the year you've input your data for. So, we do financial year, it's not going to work. It's got to be, whatever date range you've lined up with your data input. Yep, first unlucky. And here on our front end, we can see our total emissions for our enterprise. So our old friend, Scope 1, emissions that happened on farm within the boundaries. Scope 2, emissions that happened from electricity coming into the farm. And then Scope 3, which is from our supply chain. So that's, from the manufacturing of our fertilizer and chemicals, and also the transportation of these goods to our farm as well. And a little minus as well from these little patch of trees we have. So here we can see our total emissions profile, which it's 80 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, but even though the majority of it is methane from our sheep enterprise. So here we can see high-level data. You can download this in PDF form and also CSV form as well. But to get more data, you actually want to go into your individual enterprises. So for example, here we can see all the enterprises we ticked at the start. So beef, grain, and sheep. So if we go into our sheep, we can see we get a further breakdown of the data where it's not only from, whether it's methane, CO2 or whatever, it's actually the source of this. So no surprise, the biggest culprit, methane. With that hay we purchased and allocated to our sheep also being pretty sizable as well. And then bits and bobs here and there. And then every single little bit that was calculated is represented here as well. So for example, that Scope 1, that less than 100 kilograms of emissions, which is nothing by the way, from urea is coming from the lick block we allocated before. Yep. And down here as well, you can see that you have your emissions intensity either by including or excluding sequestration, with sheep being both from the meat and the wool. As you can see, we don't, the number between including and excluding sequestration is exactly the same because, hey, we didn't allocate any of our trees towards our sheep. And these numbers here are probably the most important numbers you look at when measuring emissions, because we all know that no farm in Australia is the same. They're all different and unique enterprises. But the fact of the matter is that a kilogram of mutton, it's a commodity, right? Same with bale of wool, it's a commodity. They're pretty standardized. It is comparing apples to apples. So these numbers in terms of emissions intensity here is how you compare and benchmark yourself to others, and probably what your supply chain cares about as well. All right, just a quick look at one of our grain crops as well. We'll go into barley because that's where we have our sequestration. So with barley, we can see we've got scope 1 emissions happening inside the boundary, scope 2 emissions from electricity, scope 3 emissions from the supply chain, and then we also have this big old minus from the trees we allocated, which gives us a net emissions. Similar to our sheep as well, we see a much bigger breakdown or a more dispersed breakdown of the individual emissions. So the biggest culprit being the fuel from our tractor, second biggest being the buying in of fertilizer and the buying in of herbicide. And then to a lesser extent, it's things like crop residue, the breakdown of the elements from our fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. And down the bottom here, you can see that we've changed our emissions intensity number by about 30, 40, about 25, 30%, 35% even, which is from allocating our trees to our crop. All right, I'll just show you the results quickly back in the slideshow, because I've actually benchmarked the emissions from here compared to some averages in Australia. So yep, if I go back in here, sorry, 1 second, let me skip through. Yep. So in terms of this little, my parents' farm, which by the way, these are false, fake numbers. My parents wouldn't let me use the farm unless, there were some good numbers put in there, because as you can see, here are some benchmarks in Australia and the sources down below and how this individual property has stacked up. So with meat and wool, we can see it's like, 5% below the range of benchmarks. So with sheep meat, it's between 6 and 8 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per a kilogram of product. And with our cropping, wheat and canola are about middle of the range, but then our barley was right at the bottom of the range without sequestration and has gone well under, including sequestration as well. So yeah, as you can see here with the data, it's interesting to look at its own. But yeah, to really see how you're stacking up, you probably want to get your hands on a benchmark from somewhere, which can be as easy as chucking into Google, sheep emissions benchmark Australia, and you'll get some results there. Just some take-home messages from me before we get stuck into having a crack ourselves, which is the number one: have a crack yourself, right? Just some other little notes as well is be aware but not afraid of upcoming changes in supply chain reporting requirements. Like, we kind of know the top end of town is thinking about this, and just be aware of it. Certainly not panic mode, but hey, be aware that it might be a thing. Get comfortable with collecting the required data for emissions accounting. So, keeping a copy of how you calculated fuel for your BAS, for example, keeping a hold of some of those receipts, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing as well is to ask some of your trusted advisors, such as agronomists and accountants, if they have a service offering for emissions, and if they use that calculator, e.g. they're on this list. And also what I was saying before, the data collected has value both for you and your supply chain. Make sure this is recognized one way or another. All right, so with that, I'll finish off with the presentation part of the presentation. But, here's our details. We have the website, aaeip.com. We also have our email contact. And we also have my phone number as well, that if you're having a crack in your own time and you've run into a spot of bother, more than welcome to give me a ring. We're also very open to hear feedback about how people find the platform and how we might be able to improve it in the future to make it as easy as possible to use. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brady. We've got a question in the chat from Howard. Who audits our inputs?
Yeah, so from my understanding, at the moment, we got to understand where the goalposts are, right? So at the moment, it's not about being carbon neutral. It's not about being no emissions. It's not about being low emissions. It's about getting comfortable with the idea of measuring emissions. So if you were to do an emissions assessment, and if you were to hand it to the likes of Greenham's, JBS, they're happy to have it, right? And as that range I was showing before, as long as what you give them vaguely fits in their range, like they're just happy to have it. But let's say, for example, for my sheep meat, instead of being 5.17, it's 3, right? It's well below the benchmark. They might tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, where'd you get that number from? Right? So in terms of audits, some of the providers here, I know they attach their signature to it. So some of the people who actually sell emissions assessments using our engine, but with their logo on it, such as Nutrien, they've kind of assured it almost the same as accounting. But if you use our platform, if you were to hand over the report to someone, it would be a case of as long as that number is believable, they're happy to have it. Yep. Any other questions before we might have a crack of doing one start to finish?
Just a question, Brady. I'm just sort of further on that. Will there be the intention in the future that platforms like AIA might start to pull all that benchmarking or baseline data together in one place so we don't, as farmers, have to go and Google what's the most relevant study that we can compare?
Yep. Well, unless people tick that little box about letting us see anonymized and aggregated data, we can't see results. We can't see how people use the platform. But going forward, yes, I know that I certainly think about that. It would be nice to, for example, when you get your results, just to have a little. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, when you get results, to have a little oh, this is how you compare, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, the idea with the EAP is that sure, we have our platform and we like people using our platform, but we're a pre-competitive solution that our platform, we think about cars or utes on farm. Our platform is a baseline second, third, fourth hand Holden Rodeo, right? It's got banged up seats. It's pretty basic. You can, chuck your tools on the back, but not too much else. But because anybody can use our engine and our software for free and do what they want with it, that if you want to have things such as auditability and benchmarking, et cetera, the likes of our integrators can, sell you a Hilux full of bells and whistles and obviously charge you a little bit more for it.
Yeah. And is there a good guide that people can actually, when they're in, you sort of talked us through it today, but is there a guide or a manual that as they're going through it, people can read notes?
It's a good question,
yes.
Shannon. Yeah. Sorry, Brady, off you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, on our website, we do have our help page, which has some guides on there. As you can see, there's a few for grains. But to be honest, we're looking to build out more help guides with there. We also have, demo videos being published shortly for livestock with GGA and grains through GRDC. But we probably plan to do a few more resources here and there throughout the year. But that being said, as you go through, there are little help boxes which pop up here or there, which will guide you in the right direction. So yeah, when going through, look out for the little blue box and look out for the little yellow box as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Shannon, do you mind if I also jump in there as well? I think AgVic is also putting out a report in like the next month or so, looking at some of those baselines for different livestock producers across Victoria. Because again, your emissions and your sequestration is going to be related to your rainfall partially, which is why Brady talked it through the calculator, which is why we look at different areas of Victoria in different comparisons. I'll share some on-farm emission case studies in the chat now, but maybe once that report's available, I can pass it on to you to share with the group.
I've just popped a link into the report.
Thank you, Greg.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
just been released.
Oh, awesome. Great. Oh, sorry.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect.
No, sorry. It's just good timing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, in terms of doing a quick demo from start to finish, being where we have half an hour left, I know, Tanya, you were saying that Cam Nicholson sent through some example data. That, yeah, I have my example data as well, but to give a different result and to make things a bit more exciting, we can always go through Cam's as well.
Yep, your data is also available in the chat as well, Brady, if people do want to follow along.
Yep. So, yeah, if you want to have a crack with this at home, I did make some data packs, I suppose, which I'll just show that quickly. That, for example, collecting all the data for this, it might be something new to do, something unfamiliar, but I just want to get used to using the platform and getting used to knowing what numbers you have to put in, et cetera, et cetera. I just made some fake data points based on some hypothetical AIA affiliated companies, such as AgWorld, which for legal reasons is no way based off AgWorld, which I actually did say. So yeah, so for example, in here it has all the data for your crop in kind of a report format you might see if you're a cropper. In AIA Web, which is in no way based off AgriWeb. You got stocking data and feed data as well. And then, we also have a little petrol station and a little electricity concern. So yeah, if you want to have a crack yourself at home, but have felt like you might not have your own data that you can put in just yet, then yeah, more than welcome to use these resources to go through.
I did email through both sets of data, so everyone should have the AIA data as well as CAM's data to have a go with. So
Yeah.
how would you like Brady to do how do we do this so that everyone can have a go at putting some data in and just having a play with the calculator?
Yeah. Well, I can put the link in the chat to the portal, the website, which it might be the opportunity to just get logged in. Sorry, Chantel, you're on mute.
Thanks, Brady. So if everyone just wants to log into the AIA website, like Brady did right at the beginning, the website address is there in the chat. Just shout out if you have any trouble.
Yeah, so keep in mind when you log in, as I was saying before, you put in your email address, you get a code sent to your email. And yeah, that's your login every single time, never a password. Maybe another 10, 20 seconds. And obviously just shout out in the comments if we're not quite there.
If you are getting stuck on a step as well, too, please feel free to raise your hand. And if you don't want to do it in front of the whole group, I'm happy to set up a breakout room for us to talk on the side as well.
Can I just ask another quick question, Brady, while people are logging in?
Yep.
If people are doing things like rotational grazing, improving their perennial pastures to hopefully improve things like soil carbon, you sort of cover that in the tool. How does that get captured in the tool? Is that just through the live weight gain if you're doing like grazing, or should you be doing soil carbon testing?
Yes. So in terms of efficient grazing practices, et cetera, that would be reflected in things such as live weight gain and getting to market weight a bit quicker and off your farm a bit quicker. So, for example, the best way to reduce your emissions from methane from cattle, for example, is get them to market weight and get them off your farm a bit quicker.
Yep.
If you're really working, you could play around with feed efficiency in the feed tab, because there's a linear relationship between how much feed efficiency and methane. Obviously, more feed efficient cattle is like the less feed they're eating to put on weight, the less methane they put out. But that being said, in terms of soil carbon and pastures, the tool does not refer to soil carbon. So in terms of sequestration, you have trees, right?
Yep.
But in terms of soil carbon, it's a bit more fickle, it's a bit more volatile. I know this because I used to do soil carbon projects for a job. And in terms of soil carbon as well, people always need to remember that soil carbon goes up, soil carbon goes down. And normally when it goes down, it's when everything else is going down as well, e.g. dry years, et cetera, et cetera. So if soil carbon was in the tool, which in no way, nowhere in the world is an industry standard to include soil carbon. It's not recommended by GAF. It's not recommended by the new reporting guidelines. If it wasn't there, I would say it would probably be a net bad thing, because sure, in good years, you're getting some soil sequestration, but in bad years, when you're having to destock, your livestock numbers aren't looking great, you're getting additional emissions hit from the decrease in your soil carbon.
That's good to know.
Is everybody going? Is everybody in and up to the section of creating their property? Creating the...
Yeah.
As everyone has a go at those polygraphs, or okay, Beth is still waiting for her code. All right. Just a note as well, there's a few other improvements that aren't included in the calculators because the research isn't quite there yet. So they're newer emerging fields. Things like everyone's talking a lot about 3-NOP and other additives that you can do. Even if you are implementing those on your farm currently and starting some of those emission reduction methods, those aren't counted in the calculators either.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that I think with the tool, it needs to realize like what it is, that it's roughly right and precisely wrong. If we think about a telling a time analogy, that the tool is designed to tell the time to the hour, right? Somebody to ask you what the time is, like, oh, it's 11, 12 o'clock, right? It's approximate. Whether if you want to tell the time to a minute or a second, that probably requires getting in a specialist sustainability consultant, which all of a sudden turns, a tool that you can do in an hour, half an hour for free into something which will cost a few $1,000s and take a day or two. But going forward, we're always like, once the research comes out a bit more and we can more definitively say like, this has this effect on your emissions and it does it consistently, then yes, we might be able to chuck in a little button or a little slider that changes it. But for the meantime, we got to have ease of use, kind of get annoying these pesky little things of, having every single bell and whistle.
And you did say, didn't you, that the way AIO works, that as these changes come through and these methods are approved, that AIA will be automatically updated, so people don't need to worry whether is that right? So that it'll just come in the tool.
Yep. So it's automatically versioned. So when updates come in, If you're using our platform, it will be automatically updated to the latest research, the latest science. So you're comparing apples to apples. I'll give you an example with some of the benefits of this. So before joining AIA, I was working for Elders, and Elders, up until about 2 weeks ago, used to own a feedlot, which is the majority of our emissions. For the emissions factor for feedlot for grain-fed cattle in Australia under GAF, it was based on a study that was done in the 1980s in Florida on dairy cattle, and then a study came out from LMLA about grain-fed cattle in Australia in 2020, which halved the emissions factor, which like pretty much took a quarter off of Elders' emissions overnight. So yeah, there's lots of research being done by the RDCs and other organizations to get more accurate emissions factors.
Yep.
That's why Zero Net Emissions CRC has been funded. A few other good research organizations who are doing great work. And yeah, when these new numbers come in, we chuck them in the tool and it gets automatically applied.
Right.
Yep. So are we all up to the new property stage? Yep. So once again, it's just a case of either you zoom into your property and select the parcel, or you just choose the region here, which region pretty much means state. The only exception being that WA is cut in two because it's too big of a state anyway. Yep, so I'm sure for all you guys choose Vic, but if you select your parcel, it will select it for you. The only other real reason to select your parcel other than automatically choosing your region is you can draw maps on it, which obviously you don't have to do that. If you want to create something in the ether, it's just a case of doing if you want to do something in the ether, it's just a case of doing the things you normally do anyway, which is what enterprises are running, the region, the rainfall, and confirm. Yeah, that's just in case you can't find your property on the map, and then all of a sudden, yeah, it's exactly the same as before, but there's not the nice little red boundary here. But everything else in the tool is exactly the same, except for obviously I can't use my handy patty maps I made before. All right, so once again, map shapes, well, we can't do anyway because we're not actually attached to a parcel of land, and products and commodities for the most part are irrelevant. So back into business activities, where as you can see, once again, all the commodities we selected before are here. So our sheep, our grain, our pasture, and our trees. So we're all navigated here. We can go create a sheep mob from scratch. Sheep mob, I call it sheep mob because sheep herd just sounds unnatural to me. Choose your emissions year, which once again, you can either do it to a calendar year, financial year, whatever makes sense. Because the data pack I sent before was calendar year, we'll run it that way. So January 2025. Thanks, Greg. Go select. And then from breeding ewes, if we go to AIA Web, we can go look at our mob numbers. So here in the summer, it's starting off as 120. So we go into edit livestock. 120. Average weight, which we can go 60. Yep. And we just got to do it for every month. Just a handy tip as well. In terms of the actual calculator, it actually calculates it per season. So for me, for example, I just do the same for each month of the season because the calculator would add up those numbers and divide it by 3 anyway. All right. So here, 120, and then still going off my data from my AIA web. That's 60 for summer, 58 for autumn, 60 for winter, 63 for spring. So I'm just going to go through and put it down each individual one here. All right, now it's into spring, we can start chucking on those kilograms. I personally normally do it over winter. Yep. And then changes from births, deaths, and aging. Now, in terms of aging up, because the lambs are born and hit the floor over winter, the lambs we do keep are hitting 1 year old around May, June, July. So it's just a case of adding another 40 there for the ones that are aging up after, going from ewe lamb to maiden breeding ewe to breeding ewe. Keep in mind that when you put in 40 here, the calculator won't automatically recognize that it's come from the next category down. So when you put in 40 in breeding ewes from the maiden breeding ewes aging up, you do need to obviously minus 40 from the other side, which it might be a case of writing that little note in your pen and paper. Yep, so we'll go plus 40. Good question, Robin. I'll finish this and get to that one. So yeah, we've done plus 40 in May, and then on our AIA web, we can see that we've sold 40 in November at a sale weight of 63 kilograms. So we'll just add a sale or purchase. So we'll do a sale, we've sold 40, and instead of 1.5 kilo each, I'm going to calculate total, which calculates the average weight by the amount sold, which gives me the total weight. Yep. And then we can do our lambing rates if we so wish as well. Yep. So Robin, I can give an answer that's an opinion, but I can't actually give you a definitive answer on this about exporting electricity. So in terms of minusing your emissions, that probably sits outside your electricity sale business, probably sits outside the context of your farming enterprise, right? So the emissions coming into your property as scope 2, scope 3s, yeah, like that's emissions that have happened externally that go towards your cropping enterprise. So for example, for most people, the electricity is going towards their office use, or if you've got irrigation, it's going towards there, or, powering the shearers in the shearing shed. And there's also a consideration here that with electricity as well. So with those kilowatt hours, if it's renewable, it's not zero. It's not a minus number. It's actually zero. So if you are exporting renewable electricity, it's not any minus numbers. It's not sucking carbon down from the atmosphere. It's just not putting out carbon in the first place. Right. So speaking of my old jobs before and how I used to do soil carbon, I used to work in Southeast Asia doing carbon credits and renewable energy certificates for wind and solar plants. And for them, in poor countries that are determined by the World Bank to be less developed countries, they can make carbon credits from zero emissions electricity. But here in Australia, because renewables are already widespread and are not additional, e.g. wouldn't happen otherwise from the emissions from the funding from carbon credits, you can't get a minus out of carbon. You can't get a minus out of electricity. If you did want to monetize those kilowatt hours, you could sell some renewable energy certificates, but for 500 kilowatts, yeah, probably not worth it. But yeah, for here, we've completed our stocking numbers for our sheep, at least for one category. Yep, you just might need to put the live weight total for the year up here. Yep. So for this one, Now that we've done our breeding ewes, we can move on to our maiden breeding ewes, which if you go back into our AAA web, we can see that it's about 40 for the year. So I'll put in 40. Keep in mind, we're going to start off as a higher number as they're growing and then end up at a lower number because our emissions year starts halfway through their breeding cycle. So we'll go 52. 52 for summer, 55 for autumn. And then actually in May, that's when they age up to maiden breeding ewes. It's from maiden breeding ewes to breeding ewes. And then in June, that's when we're going to have our ewe lambs aging up into maiden breeding ewes. So we'll add 40 there. But you still need to put the weight in. I'm sorry, it's just how the calculator works. But keep in mind, we're not increasing from 55 because our 55 kilogram maiden breeding ewes have just aged up and left this category. So we're going to do some lambs at a lower weight, which they're about 45 at this point in our AAA web. So we'll go 45 over winter and then 50 over spring. Yeah, and then 52 over winter, over summer to complete the cycle that we started up here. And then, yeah, we just need to put an average for the entire year, which you can put these numbers together and minus them. Put these numbers together and then divide by 4. Or we can just put in an approximate number of saying, let's just say 50.
Brady, we've got a question in the chat here from Jason. How is hay production for on-farm feed calculated?
So in terms of hay production, if you buy in, you're just putting in under energy and commodity purchases. If you produce it on farm, you do hay production as if you were doing a crop. So it's similar how we did a crop before. So for example, our barley crop, you do it as is. You say how much fertilizer you used, how much chemicals you used, how often you were running your tractor, etc., etc. But the only difference is that for the final tab of allocating emissions, which I'll just go show quickly, for allocation to enterprises, I'll just go back to my other property quickly. For allocation to enterprises, you allocate the emissions from that hay to your sheep or your cattle. So for example, with my barley, if that's getting, instead of going to Asahi, that's going into some nice hay bales for the sheep to eat, I just allocate, 100% of that to my sheep mob. And then those emissions, they stay on farm instead of being part of an individual commodity. And then those emissions are put towards your sheep mob. Yeah, hopefully that answered it. But yeah, in terms of like the rest of the emissions from hay production, like, yeah, that'll be captured in, tractor use and, having to run the hay baler and all that. Yeah, that'll be captured in fuel use. All right, but back to our sheep mob. So keep going down sequentially. If we go to our ewe lambs, we'll go in there and say there's 40. I've never ever had a single animal death, even though you would probably be putting that in. Yeah, so we look at my AI web in the summer. They're sitting at 35. So we'll do that for January and February, and maybe for December as well. And then I go up to 45 in over autumn, just before they age up. And then in May, when they have their first birthday, they get aged up to the next category. So put in minus 40 to have these go up to the next class of animals. But also at the same time, we have 40 born in June. Yep. at a weight of 15 kilograms each over winter. And then, yeah, just keep aging up, keep adding these weights as you go through. So we'll just say 30 for the spring, getting nice and fat. Yeah, and then the average for the year, which once again, you can put all these numbers together and divide by 4, or just do an approximate number of, let's say, 30. In terms of that question just there, Shannon, you can include trees that are already there. So for an AccuScheme carbon credit project, you can only get carbon credits for planting new trees, e.g. doing something different. But with counting sequestration and insetting, you don't have to generate carbon credits through the clean energy regulator. You can claim from trees that are already there. But that being said, Shannon, trees are only storing a lot of carbon when they're growing. So in terms of impactful, unless you have a lot of trees, say over 10% of your property, in terms of the impact of those trees, it's probably negligible once you get over 30 years old. So yes, say if you planted some trees 10 years ago, you can put that in the tool. Don't worry, it's not a financial instrument at this point. It's just you getting credit for the trees, the carbon the trees are sucking down on your property. But that being said, if you pull out an emissions audit at the end and you want to lower that emissions number, hey, go ahead and plant more trees. I'm sure the Landcare crew would love to hear that.
So if you had the first time you used the tool, you had 5 hectares of your property under trees, you would enter 5 hectares of plantings. Is that right? And then say the next year you do another hectare. Do you only enter 1 hectare, or would you enter 6 hectares because you've now got 6 hectares of plantings?
I would personally put in 2 separate entries because the age of the trees are different.
Yep.
And in terms of trees and sucking down carbon, the younger the better.
Okay. Yep. So you keep doing, if you do something every year, you'd enter them each as new plantings.
Yeah. And you can just keep doing that consistently. Yep. But sorry, with our ewe lambs, I missed a bit there. So when we were born, we started off at 85. Apologies. And then, yeah, we're going to sell off 40 in February, 40 kilograms each. Yeah, just for those following along. Yeah, so we're going to sell off 45 at 40 kilograms each. Save and close. Yeah. Quickly rams. I might do these ones really quickly so we can at least get our sheep mob done. So we're going to have 8. And we're going to have this year, to be lazy as well, we're just going to say all of them weigh 90. And instead of doing seasonal changes in their weight, I'm just going to go autofill blank live weight fields, which just means it's 90 for the year, which is not accurate. It's not true to the tool and how you should be using it. But if you go through this, it will just say this animal weighed exactly the same amount for the entire year, and it will give you a more general, quicker number. Yes, Tani?
Brady, for those that don't have monthly weights of their animals, is there still value in guesstimating using some of these tools? Say, for example, you've only weighed them every 3 months coming in the yard.
Yeah, and I would say for a lot of producers, even weighing every 3 months isn't super duper common. I know what I do personally is I just estimate and go like, right, they lose a couple kilograms over summer, they gain a couple kilograms over spring, and just, use your knowledge of the conditioning of the animals to add and subtract a few kilograms here or there. But obviously, when they are yarded up, take the opportunity just to chuck 1 or 2 from each class on the scales and see where they're at.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you.
And finally, I might just quickly finish off with the weather lambs. Yep. We're actually going to have 0 up until they're born in June, and then we're going to go plus 85. actually plus 85 here as well, because it's cycling from down here to up here, remembering that we've had to mix in our sheep enterprise to line up with our grains enterprise so we can get a consistent emissions year. And then we're going to sell all 85 in February at a live weight of 40 each. Yep. Oops, my bad. Go to the live weights. Let me go to my AA web. They're going to be 35, 35, and then 15. Yep. Quickly rush through and do electricity so we can get a number at the end quickly. Where once again, with electricity, just say how much you used. And the source about whether it's from the grid or whether it's renewable. And then with our fuel use, say diesel, petrol, got a diesel ute in my base model Rodeo. So yep, we'll go from there. And then try and get an accurate number from your BAS. Fuel use for livestock enterprises maybe like 1-2%. For cropping enterprises between 10 and 25%. But obviously still try and get an accurate number if you can. So let's just say, I don't know, 320 for the year that I used 4 tanks of fuel for my tiny little enterprise. And then with these emissions here, we just got to allocate them to our sheep mob. Because if we don't allocate them, the emissions go towards whole of enterprise, but not towards the individual emissions intensity. Yep, so just quickly pull out our result at the end for the work we did. Yeah, so once again, whole of enterprise, but we wanted to see individual results. We can go into our sheep mob and see our emissions intensity down here, noting that how we were saying before, it was between 6 and 8, and average for sheep in Australia. Notice how it's 10, even though it's the same numbers before. That's because we're not having half the emissions go to wool. Yeah, because we didn't add in shearing before. Let's just say these are Dorpers or something like that. All the emissions are going towards the running of the sheep and the meat there. So yeah, with that, I might leave people to go do the rest of this at home themselves using the handy tools of AA Web, AA World, AA Petroleum, and AA Energy. Yeah, thanks once again for Landcare Victoria for having us and providing that great presentation at the start. I think there's great value in that, and hopefully others can have a chance to read through those slides another time. And yeah, certainly thanks today for everyone joining and participating. I'm going to leave my phone number down here at the bottom. I'm available to help if people are stuck at any point for a quick call to go through it. Can also jump on a little video call as well. My time is paid for to help people do little bits and bobs here to get it through. And also there's value in us to learn how people are using the tool and what questions they might have and, where people might be getting stuck and what we might need to improve. So, yep. Thanks once again for Tanya and the Landcare Vic team for having me today and having Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, Brady. I guess last call if anyone has any final questions for Brady. I know we have gone a little over time.
Thank you, Ron.
Lovely. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to pass back to Chantel, but I want to quickly give Shannon and Chantel a shout out for all their hard work in pulling this together. I also want to shout out the Northeast CMA who helped fund today's event. We've got a feedback form that I've just posted in the chat. This is super helpful both for AIA and for us in terms of understanding whether today was useful and if there's areas that we can further resource. So any feedback you have, positive or negative, is super helpful in helping both us run future events and AIA look at future updates. But Chantel, Shannon, I might hand back over to you guys.
And again, I just want to thank everybody for coming along today, especially Shani and Sarah and Brady. It's been good. There's been a lot of information, and I'm sure some of you might have a lot of things swirling around in your heads. So please feel free to reach out to Brady. He's put his phone number there, or to Shannon or myself, if you've got any further questions. And perhaps even let us know if you think you'd benefit from a one-on-one, not one-on-one, a face-to-face workshop on using the calculator. Maybe that's something that we can tee up for the future. And as Tani mentioned, please provide some feedback there. The link is in the chat. Be really appreciative of your time to do that so that we can improve these things for everybody. So yes, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you all soon at the next event.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for having us today, guys. Cheers.